to some politics now. Some new information on how the Republican candidates filled their campaign war chests over the summer. The latest filings show Dr. Ben Carson taking in the biggest haul, just over $20 million, thanks to major support from grassroots donors. He's followed by Jeb Bush at $13.4 million, and you see Ted Cruz rounding out the top three with $12.2. As Chris Christie, Donald Trump, and Rand Paul trail the pack, of course, we have to remember that the billionaire real estate developer, Donald Trump, is funding his own campaign, so he's not as dependent on donors, and we see that with that number. Senator Rand Paul was on America's Newsroom earlier saying he's not going anywhere.
Leaders at this point don't indicate necessarily the winner, so we shouldn't jump to a conclusion and completely exclude people who are not in the lead right now. I fully believe that the leaders in the Republican primary will not be those who are leading currently.
Doug Thornell is former spokesman for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and former communications director to Maryland Congressman Chris Van Hollen. And David Avella is chairman of GoPac, which raises money for Republican candidates. It's nice to have you both today. And we're going to focus a little bit on the GOP candidates first, but we're going to talk about both parties as far as fundraising. David, you're close to this issue, obviously, as a fundraiser. Who do you think is at the most risk here? When you look at the money that has been raised, who do you think is really on the edge of being able to stay in this race?
Never in history, Jenna, has a military won a ground war without troops. And for campaigns, that is the small dollar donors. So the smart campaigns are investing in getting those small dollar donors to build a ground game because Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada are all ground wars. And so if you look at what Dr. Carson is doing, it is impressive. If you look at what Governor Bush and Senator Rubio are doing, all bringing in small dollar donors, they're doing that one part of the campaign well. Though you still have to have the larger dollar donors as well to make sure that you have the dollars to advertise, because while you can have a great army, you also have to have the air cover.
Okay, and the analogy is well taken, but you're not answering my question. Who do you think is at the greatest risk of dropping out because the money's simply not there?
Sure, Jenna, any of those that aren't bringing in small dollar donors because they're not ultimately going to have all of those at the bottom that aren't bringing in donors to help fund their efforts. So whether that be Governor Gilmore, whether that be Governor Pataki, all of those at the bottom, look, their days are numbered unless they can get their fundraising on track.
You know, that's what's really interesting.
Let me, Jenna, I would just say, ahead. I think, just to give you three names, I think Rand Paul, I think Mike Huckabee, and I think Governor Christie really need to pick up their fundraising efforts in the fourth quarter. They are in risk.
And what do you see as the timeline on that, Doug? You know, because that's one of the things we're looking at is when does the field start to narrow, and when do we actually see the consequences of fundraising?
Well, we've already seen it with Scott Walker dropping out. And this is a perfect example of a candidate who was probably too reliant on his super PAC. His super PAC has millions and millions of dollars in the bank right now. They're not going to be able to spend it because he's not in the race, because he didn't really run an efficient campaign. We also saw it with Governor Perry. So we're starting to see people fall off. And I think probably in the next couple months, we're going to see that happen with some of the lower tier candidates on the Republican side.
Because, as we know, the polls are early, but the money does matter, David. And again, going back to the business that you're in, it's interesting. One of the reports that we were looking at today shows that the Democrat candidates are especially good at the grassroots, small donations, where the Republicans aren't as good. We mentioned Ben Carson is doing a good job, but he's doing a good job overall. You see him at the top of the fundraising pack right now. Is that an issue for Republicans? Are Republicans over-reliant on super PACs?
Well, let me say no to that. Look, there will be, when we have a nominee, when everyone rallies around one person, we're going to have the number of small dollar donors. Look at the last presidential race. Governor Romney had an impressive group of small dollar donors. It requires, though, making sure you have the right message and being able to advertise that. And that's where they come together. That's where the small dollar and the big dollar donors come together. And it's fun to note that the Dems have a lot of small dollar donors. They have a lot of big billionaires funding their campaigns as well, like Tom Steyer and George Soros. So let's not get into this false premise that somehow Doug's team doesn't have billionaires funding Hillary Clinton.
There's a lot of big money in general. Involved in politics. I think we're fair and balanced as far as that assertion across the board. But Doug, let me ask you about that. You know, there's not as many options for the Democrats. So we're all trying to read into the tea leaves. There's simply just not the number of candidates, but really when you see who emerged from the debate, you really have two central candidates. So is the money really telling us anything right now when it comes to the Democrats, just because there's so few options?
Well, I think it tells you that there's a lot of excitement at the small dollar grassroots level. You have Bernie Sanders has 600,000 donors. Hillary Clinton had 400,000. That eclipses almost every single Republican. Ben Carson is doing a good job on that front. But there's a lot of excitement there combined between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. They're outraising the top 5 other Republicans. So I think if you're looking at big picture, you've got to be impressed with the enthusiasm out there on the Democratic side. And I think long term, David mentioned a good point about the ground troops. What I think is interesting is the fact that, Jeb Bush spent a good deal of money. His burn rate was almost 90%. And he really only has a handful of staffers in Iowa and New Hampshire. And that's not going to be good enough if he wants to win in those places in January and February. So long term, I agree with David about the ground troops. That's very important. And I think Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are making those early investments.
Interesting. We'll see, again, where the investments are actually made. We haven't even started really into the campaign season where we're going to see the commercials and everything else. So it'll be interesting to see where the money goes exactly. David and Doug, great to have you both. Thank you so much.